Thank you, Madam President. Thank you, members of the Security Council. On behalf of the Secretary General, I will devote this briefing today to presenting the 7th report on the implementation of Security Council Resolution 2334, covering the period from the 13th of June to the 12th of September this year. I will focus on developments on the ground in accordance with the provisions of the resolution, including on regional and international efforts to advance peace. Let me iterate from the very beginning that these developments cannot be divorced from the broader context: Israel's continued military occupation of Palestinian territory, uncertainties about the future of the peace process and the two-state solution, Hamas's continuing hold on Gaza, its militant activity, including rocket attacks and tunnel construction, unilateral actions that undermine peace efforts, reduced donor support for the Palestinian Authority, and turmoil in the wider region. I would like to highlight from the onset the very serious financial situation UNRWA continues to face. We welcome the contributions of several member states recently announced and urge additional new funding be provided for its critical work. On September 27th, a ministerial meeting in support of UNRWA will be held on the margins of the General Assembly, and I urge all participants to engage constructively and ensure the continuity of the agency's vital services. Madam President, no steps have been taken during the reporting period to, quote, seize all settlement activity in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, end quote, as required by the resolution. I reiterate that all settlement activities are a violation of international law and a major obstacle to peace. Some 2,800 housing units in settlements in Area C of the occupied West Bank were advanced, approved, or tendered by Israel. Approximately one-third of these units are in outlying settlements deep in the West Bank. Plans for some 1,100 units were advanced in the approval process. Plans for an additional 600 units reached the final approval stage, and tenders were announced for about 1,100 units. A tender was also announced for 603 housing units in the Ramat Shlomo neighborhood, the first tender in East Jerusalem since 2016. On August the 28th, the District Court in Jerusalem ruled that illegal outpost of Mitzpeh Kramim can be legalized under Israeli law, despite being built partially on private Palestinian land. The ruling was the first to rely on the so-called market regulation principle, which allows houses being built in good faith on private land without the consent of the owner to be retroactively legalized and the owner compensated. If the ruling is upheld in Israel's High Court of Justice, it could enable the legalization of additional outposts and housing units in settlements. Madam President, demolitions and seizures of Palestinian-owned structures continued across the West Bank and East Jerusalem. Citing the absence of Israeli-issued building permits, which are nearly impossible for Palestinians to obtain, 117 structures were demolished or seized, 61 in Area C and 56 in East Jerusalem. According to OCHA, this resulted in the displacement of 145 Palestinians, including 82 children, and affected the livelihoods of some 950 people. In Khan al-Ahmar, Abu al-Khelo, a Bedouin community of 181 people, Israeli authorities requisitioned land, leveled access routes, and temporarily declared the area a closed military zone in advance of the expected demolition of its structures. Following a protracted legal process, on the 5th of September, the High Court of Justice denied several petitions by residents to prevent the demolition. On the 4th of July, in Abu Nawar, a Bedouin community of around 600 residents, 19 structures were demolished. OCHA reported that 51 people, including 33 children, were displaced. Later that month, a donor-funded caravan in the Bedouin community of Jabal al-Baba, serving as a kindergarten for 28 children and as a women's center, was also confiscated and dismantled. These communities are located in or next to an area that is slated for settlement plans in the E1 area, which, if constructed, would create a continuous build-up area between Ma'ale Adumim and East Jerusalem. In July, the Israeli Knesset approved a law transferring the jurisdiction of certain petitions against decisions by Israeli authorities in the West Bank from the High Court of Justice to the Administrative Affairs Court in Jerusalem. This step could make it more difficult and costly to challenge the demolition or seizure of Palestinian properties in Area C. On the 11th of September, the European Union High Representative for Foreign Policy, Federica Mogherini, called on Israeli authorities to reconsider the decision to allow the demolition of Khan al-Ahmar warning that, quote, it would have grave humanitarian consequences, end quote, and contravene international humanitarian law. This call was reiterated by Germany, France, Italy, Spain, and the United Kingdom. I also issued a statement expressing the same concern over such action. On the 13th of September, the European Parliament also called for monetary compensation for financial losses should Khan al-Ahmar be demolished. Madam President, members of the Security Council, let me turn to the issue of violence, which also remains an obstacle to peace. The reporting period saw significant incidents and escalation that brought Israel and Hamas almost to war on at least 3 occasions. Palestinian protesters at the Gaza fence continued on almost a daily basis. While on most occasions they remained fairly peaceful, militants placed improvised explosive devices, attempted to breach the fence, and continued to send incendiary kites and balloons across the border. The Israeli Defense Forces responded with riot dispersal means and live fire. During protests throughout the reporting period, 29 Palestinians were killed or died of wounds sustained previously, including 10 children. Some 900 people were injured by live ammunition. 1 Israeli soldier was killed and another injured. In successive rounds of hostilities, Hamas and other Palestinian militants fired some 500 rockets, Grad missiles, and mortars from Gaza towards Israel. In response, the IDF fired some 400 missiles and tank shells at targets inside Gaza. It destroyed 3 tunnels leading from Gaza into Israel. 18 Palestinians were killed, including 5 children, 118 injured, and 37 Israelis were injured in these exchanges. On at least 3 occasions, the situation escalated dramatically. Calm was only restored after Egypt and the United Nations intervened to de-escalate tensions. Incendiary kites and balloons continue to be launched from Gaza into neighboring Israeli communities. In the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, 26 Palestinians, including 5 women and 54 children, were injured in clashes with Israeli security forces during search and arrest operations and demonstrations. On the 23rd of July, a 15-year-old Palestinian was killed during clashes in Bethlehem's Al-Duhayshe refugee camp. 3 days later, in the settlement of Adam, a 17-year-old Palestinian stabbed and killed an Israeli man and injured 2 others. On the 17th of August and 3rd of September, Israeli security forces shot dead an Israeli Arab and a Palestinian in Jerusalem's Old City and in Hebron, respectively, after they reportedly attempted to carry out stabbing attacks against security forces. On the 27th of July, clashes erupted at the Temple Mount Haram al-Sharif compound between Palestinians and Israeli security forces, where 10 Palestinians and 4 Israeli police officers were injured. On the 16th of September, in another attack, a Palestinian teenager stabbed and killed an Israeli American outside of a shopping mall in the occupied West Bank. It is reprehensible that Hamas and other factions choose to glorify this attack. Madam President, despite the call in Security Council Resolution 2334 for the parties to refrain from acts of provocation, incitement, and inflammatory rhetoric, such statements continued. Hamas leaders continued to incite violence, with one senior official speaking of, and I quote, cleansing Palestine of the filth of Jews, end quote, and threatening to decapitate Israeli leaders. Fatah's official media pages continued to glorify perpetrators of previous attacks against Israelis and failed to condemn terror attacks against civilians. Some religious leaders and officials made inflammatory statements accusing Israel of plotting to destroy the Al-Aqsa Mosque and denying the Jewish historic and religion connection to Jerusalem. Meanwhile, some Israeli officials called for the targeting of Palestinians, launching incendiary kites and balloons into Israel from Gaza, and the extrajudicial killings of Hamas officials. One member of the Knesset called for Israel to reconquer Gaza and insisted that Palestinians in Gaza either acquiesce to Israel's sovereignty or emigrate. Others continued to provoke by rejecting the Palestinian right to statehood, supporting settlement growth and the annexation of parts of the West Bank. Resolution 2334 reiterated calls made by the Middle East Quartet for, I quote, affirmative steps to be taken immediately to reverse negative trends on the ground that are imperiling the two-state solution, end quote. Some positive steps have been taken, including Israel releasing some $44 million of withheld Palestinian health stamp revenues. This has resulted in the continuing direct engagement. This is the result of the continuing direct engagement of the finance ministries of both sides, as well as continued progress on Gaza reconstruction. The Rafah crossing between Gaza and Egypt remained largely open during the reporting period, with the number of people crossing reaching over 12,000 in both June and July. Madam President, the negative developments, however, outweigh the positive news. Most worrying, perhaps, is the continuing deterioration of the humanitarian, security, and political situation in Gaza, as the implementation of the Egyptian brokered October agreement remains stalled and the Palestinian Authority has not been enabled to take up its responsibilities in Gaza. As we meet today, the power crisis in Gaza is coming to a head. The United Nations has run out of funding for emergency fuel. This puts critical health, water, and sanitation facilities at immediate risk of shutting down, while essential medicines are at critically low levels. On the 5th of September, the United Nations delivered the final stocks of available emergency fuel to Gaza. Despite calls for donors to urgently contribute, little additional funding has been forthcoming. The situation was worsened by the temporary closure of the Kerem Shalom crossing and reductions in the fishing zone that were introduced by Israel during the periods of escalation, as well as the continuing measures by the Palestinian Authority to reduce salaries, energy supply, and overall spending in Gaza. The UN humanitarian coordinator has released $1 million from the emergency pooled fund to cover fuel for hospitals and water and sanitation facilities to prevent a full collapse of essential services. To address the chronic crisis in the occupied Palestinian territory, the humanitarian community appealed for nearly $550 this year through the Humanitarian Response Plan, 75% of which is for projects targeting Palestinians in Gaza. At present, Madam President, the appeal is less than 29% funded, one of the most poorly funded appeals in the world. Ladies and gentlemen, Security Council Resolution 2334 called on member states, and I quote, to distinguish in their relevant dealings between the territory of the State of Israel and the territories occupied in 1967, end quote. No such steps were taken during the reporting period. The resolution also called upon all parties to continue, inter alia, to exert collective efforts to launch credible negotiations. No progress was achieved in this respect. The United States has repeatedly announced that it is continuing its efforts aimed at a comprehensive peace plan. In August, the administration suspended more than $200 million in the fiscal year 2017 economic support funds for the West Bank and Gaza, and a further $25 million for the East Jerusalem Hospitals Network. On September 10th, it closed the Palestine Liberation Organization office in Washington, citing its failure to take steps towards meaningful negotiations with Israel and concerns with Palestinian attempts to prompt an investigation of Israel by the International Criminal Court. The Palestinian Central Council convened in August and ratified the continued severance of political relations with the United States until the latter revisits its decision regarding Jerusalem, Palestine refugees, and settlements. On the 5th of September, the government of Paraguay announced that it would reverse the previous decision from May of this year to relocate its embassy in Israel to Jerusalem and move it back to Tel Aviv. Since the escalation of hostilities in Gaza in July, the United Nations has led an unprecedented effort with the governments of Egypt, Israel, and other international partners to prevent another outbreak of hostilities, respond to the most urgent humanitarian needs, and support the return of the legitimate Palestinian government to Gaza, a crucial element to any political effort to resolve the wider conflict. The UN has enhanced its capacity in Gaza to work with the Palestinian government and the Israeli counterparts to support donor implementation on all issues related to the Gaza reconstruction mechanism and provide accountable and transparent reporting to donors. The World Bank has increased its allocation from $55 million to $90 million for the West Bank and Gaza over the next year, part of which will be used to create some 4,400 short-term employment opportunities. UNDP has also accelerated its emergency economic assistance program with support from several donors. Madam President, in closing, I would like to share some broad observations concerning the implementation of the provisions of Resolution 2334 during the reporting period. First, the expansion of Israeli settlements remains illegal under international law and continues to erode the viability of the two-state solution. Particularly alarming are legal and administrative steps which could consolidate and expand settlement activity deep in the West Bank, further undermining the contiguity of a future Palestinian state. The persistent threat of demolitions and displacement of Palestinians in Area C, including in Khan al-Ahmar, Abu al-Hinu, is of great concern. The 5th September decision of the High Court of Justice places the Bedouin community at imminent risk of demolition. Demolitions undermine the prospects for a two-state solution and are also in violation of international law. Violence, terror, and the risk of conflict in Gaza remain an obstacle to peace. I welcome the calm since the 9th of August, but am very concerned by consistent attempts to undermine it. All sides, and let me underline that, all sides must continue their positive engagement with Egypt and the UN and do their part. Hamas and other armed militant groups must stop all provocations and attacks. Israel must improve the movement and access regime for Gaza. The Palestinian Authority must remain engaged in Gaza. The international community must address the urgent humanitarian needs. And finally, Fatah and Hamas must engage in earnest with Egypt in order to bring back the legitimate government to Gaza. I once again call for all violent actions that continue to endanger the lives of both Israelis and Palestinians to stop immediately. Indiscriminate attacks are prohibited under international humanitarian law. I urge Hamas and other Palestinian militants to end these indiscriminate firings of rockets into southern Israel. I also reiterate that Israeli security forces have a responsibility to exercise maximum restraint in the use of live fire and must not resort to lethal force unless in response to an imminent threat of death or serious injury. The continued use of live fire by the IDF is deeply concerning. The killing of children is absolutely unacceptable. I call on the international community to join the United Nations in condemning violence and incitement, which continue to fuel a climate of mutual fear and mistrust while hindering efforts to bridge the gaps between both sides. As explicitly outlined in the 2016 report of the Middle East Quartet, current trends are imperiling the viability of the two-state solution. There has been no positive movement by the parties to take steps to reverse the negative trends on the ground. By complying with their obligations under previous agreements and relevant UN resolutions, the parties can and must reverse the current course. Israel should make progress on the transition to greater civil authority of powers and responsibilities in Area C, on improving Palestinian economic prospects, as well as access to housing, water, energy, communications, agriculture, and natural resources, and on significantly easing Palestinian movement restrictions. The United Nations has been working tirelessly to address the deepening humanitarian and economic crisis on the ground. Support for emergency fuel is urgently needed to avoid a total collapse of critical services and sewage treatments and hospital care in Gaza. The Deputy Special Coordinator and Humanitarian Coordinator, Jamie McGoldrick, has made 2 emergency appeals to donors in August for new funding, and I reiterate the urgency of his calls. It is also critical that UNRWA be able to continue to deliver its vital services. In addition, the United Nations is working with several donors to advance key interventions that will immediately improve the situation on the ground, both in Gaza and the West Bank. I urge donors to consider support for these activities, which play a vital role in preventing further escalation. Madam President, members of the Security Council, 25 years have passed since the signing of the Oslo Accords. It was a historic moment that captured back then the world's attention and filled Palestinians, Israelis, and the region with hope that a genuine peace could be realized. Sadly, that courageous vision of lasting peace now lies in tatters. We must restore hope. We must restore hope that there is an alternative to this perpetual cycle of violence. We must overcome the current impasse and refocus our efforts on ultimately returning to meaningful negotiations that end the occupation and bring a just, lasting and comprehensive resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. A resolution that is based on two states, Israel and Palestine, living side by side in peace and security, with Jerusalem as the capital of both states, based on the 1967 lines and in line with relevant UN resolutions and previous agreements. I urge all sides to continue to engage with each other and with the international community to preserve and advance its achievement. Madam President, members of the Security Council, finally let me add that I want to underline today that the urgency of the situation that we face on the ground is really desperate. Gaza can explode any minute. We have a humanitarian responsibility to react, but we must also understand that it cannot be solved only on the basis of humanitarian action. It must be solved with a political perspective to resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and we have a responsibility to recreate and support the parties in this prospect. Thank you.